Hi guys, this is Bob for Truth. So it's very interesting. The world is focused on Black Lives Matter lately. Very interesting, right? Very interesting how the world's focused on Black Lives Matters. We know that there's a bunch of what they call riots that are going on, and people are out protesting, right? And so that's an open show of protests about what they're saying are the injustices done against um, people who are black, what they call African Americans. I guess it changes over time, right? And it's very interesting because one of the things that we found out, or you can find out, that George Soros is partly behind sponsoring this movement, and that they were saying that bricks were magically appearing at places almost to encourage people to destroy property, so they can capture it on TV as a photo op. And there were provocateurs who were placed within the riots, and you'd have people who would point out these provocateurs and say, "What the hell are you doing? Why are you destroying that and vandalizing that Starbucks? Why are you doing this in this neighborhood?" So some suspect that there's an agenda. There's an agenda that's more about a divide and conquer, to sort of use the divisions of the invention called race so that the people won't organize, and the focus will be off of the agenda that's going on at the top and more focused on other things. So it doesn't matter. It's just, if I get you to look over here, watch this hand, you won't watch the other hand that will be bringing everybody under subjection for the elite power structures that be, right? And so if I can get you guys to be divided based on this superficial thing called race, which you've played into up until this point, now we can say, well, you guys won't come together to fight against a common oppressor, right? This is one of the things that happened throughout several movements. If you learn about MLK, one of the things that Coretta Scott King said, where she said that the reason Martin Luther King Jr. was killed was once he got off the whole thing about it just being about black people, and he started focusing on what he called the People's Movement, where he tried to unify poor people, including quote unquote all people, regardless of quote unquote skin color. And she said when he started doing that and talking about the exploitation and the use of tax dollars that cost over $100,000 to kill each Vietnamese person, he said, how then could America find the will and the resources at over $100,000 to kill each Vietnamese person, but it couldn't find that same will and resources to treat and empower all Americans? And so MLK's message, as you know, he started to become popular around the world through the advent of TV, was starting to resonate with all these people. And then he was considered a national threat. And so what you got to understand, when people use the word national threat, that's coded language. It's not talking about a true national threat. See, the one thing that the powers that be understand is they understand divide and conquer. Now, when they're trying to divide and conquer, they point out the differences between you and I. You're white, you're black, male, female, Democrat, Republican, etc., etc. And what they try to do is they try to take away that common thing that unites, or that common part of humanity that all people want. Most people want. You would think that most people want what? Most people want a good job, a nice neighborhood to live in. They want their kids to grow up happy, free, and to be able to pursue things that they want to pursue in life without hopefully infringing upon that of their neighbor, right? Isn't that pretty common? People want shelter, they want friends, they want freedom, right? They don't want their voices stifled. So when you think about this, and you think about how people have these common things, what they call so-called the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People want these common things, right? Safety, security, food, shelter, all this kind of stuff. So there's the functional needs and there's the so-called emotional needs that people would talk about. And the so-called elites, I say so-called in quotes, the powers that be, the corporatocracy, the people who have the so-called money and power, they understand that. And so while they're trying to tell you, hey, it's national security, well, wait a minute, these companies are multinational. And in being multinational, one of the things that they do is they find places to go and take resources for. And anyone who knows about accounting, the way that you make profit is to keep your expenses low and your revenues high. And one of the most expensive things is what? Labor cost. So the same multinational corporations that say they care about America, America first, and they're quick to give you a salute and put a flag bumper sticker and tout their so-called patriotism are the same corporations that when they find out, even though they claim they're America first, and even though they try to tout that they're all about quote unquote patriotism, they'll be the first ones to go and export your job to another country. Even the ones who are ruled by people who you'd classify as so-called white. Well, if we acknowledge that most of the Fortune 500 companies, very few so-called minorities, if any, own any Fortune 500 companies or are the head CEOs, I mean, it's got to be a fraction of a fraction. So if that is the case, and we look at the heads of these Fortune 500 companies, and you look at the board members, then who's making these decisions to export your jobs, guys? And if people were to get upset, instead of getting upset at people who they say, and here's the divide and conquer, well, you know who's taking away your jobs? It's those others. Others. Whatever community you're in, it's those others who don't look like you who are taking away your job. Well, wait a minute. Let's instead of looking across, let's do something. Let's look up for a second. I'm talking carnal here. I'm just giving you a carnal analysis of things that people seem to ignore. I'm not talking spiritual here. I'm trying to give you a sense of like, let's assess the world, the quote unquote world that we live in. Because these same people who are giving you to salute, wait a minute, who are they serving? Obviously, they're serving the corporations because they say they have stockholders. And as a CEO or the leader of a large multinational corporation, a global corporation, they have something that they call fiduciary duty. And the fiduciary duty is they were to do what's best for the company. And so the tension between what's best for the company and what's best for the so-called country that they claim to be loyal to, well, sometimes that comes into conflict. So what do you do in that instance? Well, I think we can see the evidence of that. I think when it's given the choice between patriotism, which they want you to be very loyal to, charge that hill with your gun and take that bullet, and making that money, they always seem to go for that money. In fact, when we go back to that accounting, when we go to the increased revenues and reduce expenses, one of the ways that they reduce expenses is they colonize or go and get resources from other countries. Now, if you live in a country, of course, you're going to want the resources of that country to benefit the people who live there in that country, the people who are indigenous to that area. For instance, if you live in whatever state you live in and you find out that, hey, that state just found a huge gold or resources that are needed all throughout the world to build something like, I don't know, a Tesla or an iPhone or computers or TVs. You'd say, well, the fact that you found this in this area that I live in, I should be able to benefit. So why don't you, if you're digging up off the ground, then there's no way that the neighborhood or the environment or country that I live in should be poor if you found this resources within the land that I live in is worth billions upon billions, potentially trillions of dollars. Why would I be poor living in a country that has the resources that's part of a $1 trillion industry. That makes sense. That's common sense, right? Well, hence, Africa is a very, 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 very rich continent with many countries, but it also has many people. Now, for some reason, there's military bases all throughout Africa. And for some reason, as rich as Africa is, as essential as the minerals and resources that come out of Africa is, the people in Africa, for the large part, are some of the poorest people on the planet. But yet you have these billionaire philanthropists who are there to help the people out. And in helping the people out, one of the things they're doing is they're giving them medicine. Now, there's stories that since the philanthropists from the West have gotten there, the infant mortality rate has gone up. In fact, the death rate has gone up. The disease rate has gone up. And some suspect it's because of the medicine that the so-called Westerners are bringing. In fact, they found that there were sterilization agents in some of the so-called medicine, the vaccines that they were giving them. And even as I sit here trying to tell you and explain these things to you, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about censorship and what words I should and shouldn't say. Because, in America, land of the free, home of the brave, there's certain things you can't even say. In fact, one of the channels that I used to watch was called The High Wire with Dale Bigtree. Well, that channel had a bunch of doctors and scientists on it that questioned the efficacy of vaccines. And it talked about the fact that these guys didn't really test it. In fact, it was pharmaceutical driven. And how they had immunity to any lawsuit, meaning they could give it to you and you could walk in healthy. They'd give it to you the next day. Your child could go get some kind of disease and be despondent, or get some kind of neurological disorder that caused your kid to never even speak or walk again. And they have no legal liability. But yet they would try to sell you, well, sorry you got that. We have no legal liability. And by the way, we didn't tell you that that's not truly tested the way that we pretend it's tested. In fact, we outright lied to you and said it's safe and effective based on some legal criteria that our lawyers came up with. And we didn't use a double-blind placebo. So there's all these play on words and lying. But yet, what's going on now is supposed to be for your benefit. It's all for your benefit. Now, if you're even halfway awake, you notice that in America, as wealthy as America is, they're saying even in America, there's this great divide between the have and the have-nots. That the wealth is being concentrated more and more. That disparity, that wealth gap is being widened or broadened as time goes on. But not only that, when you look at that, there's a rebellion of people all across the world. Now, you don't know this because they don't typically show these things on TV. Because some suspect that there's a concentration on media. That the media conglomerates are held in the hands of a very few, just like the wealth. And the very, very wealthy, rich, and powerful elite, if they in fact are working together, and I suspect that the corporations are the ones who provide the advertising dollars, which means that if you have a media conglomerate, you're going to tout the things that the conglomerate corporations want you to tout, and you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. And so this view of the world is going to be skewed because no one's going to tell on themselves with regards to the things that they're doing. Specifically, if you're duplicitous in your actions, rhetoric, and politics. You would religiously pursue that thing that makes you more profitable, because it is, after all, a business. So, one of the things that people suspect that's going on is that corporations want to make more money. And if money makes the world go round and the rich people are gathering more money for themselves, it's pretty evident just by their actions and just by looking at data that they're not satisfied with having just some money. And they're not really wanting to spread the wealth. In fact, the biggest threat to the bottom line is what? People who may rise up and rebel. Hence, the global unrest. And so one of the things that you would want to do is you'd want to neutralize the threat. See, when you're in business, you do long-term strategic planning. And in the long-term strategic planning, you do projections. And in the projections, you project out your revenue, profit, and your expenses. But also you have to do what they call a SWOT analysis. That's the strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats. And you know what? The strength is the fact that you're in control, right? The weakness is if there was an increase in your expenses and a reduction in your revenues. The opportunity is anytime you can find efficiencies that'll help you increase your money and to explore for more resources that you can control and more market share. But the threat are those pesky people who may rise up and say, wait a minute, there's a lot of money going around. So they may threaten you from a political standpoint. They're not going to vote for things that are in the interest of the people who are the wealthy elite. Hence, you want to control the politics. They may want to take back the resources in their land. They may want to control the way money is done and not utilize your dollar system, which has strength. They may not like the laws that you have in place that lock them out of wealth through some kind of neo-colonialist plan or structure or economics or banking system. They may go against the puppets that you set in place, the people who you paid that look like them but don't really represent their interests, who sold them out because they eat well while the others starve. So all these things are threats. But how do you, as a very small group of people who are conglomerate, you're not really loyal to any quote-unquote country, and you fooled these dupes, you duped these suckers into thinking that you are patriotic. Oh, and they stand and they salute. How do you neutralize that threat without alarming the mass chattel who's become a burden to your coffers? Because as you hoard more and more wealth for yourself, well, these cattle are still having children. They're still having children. And to the extent that there's a group of those folks within that chattel system who are not contributing to your bottom dollar, because let's face it, with automation and resources and technology, you don't need as many of them as you used to. But yet they're starting to rise up all over the world because now the ability to communicate cross borders has become a little more seamless. And so that requires more propaganda to offset it, because as they know more, you have to do things to offset that knowledge. You have to do what you call counterintelligence. You need to utilize more propaganda because you got to control their mind. If you don't control their mind, if you don't keep them distracted with things like, I don't know, games, porno, I don't know, anything, reality TV, whatever it is. If you don't keep them distracted, they may start to bond together. There may be some person who rises up as a unifying force, maybe like an MLK, who says, I want to establish a poor people's movement. So at that time, you want to create a wedge. You want to continue to emphasize the things that divide them while pretending you're trying to unite them. You want to point out the fact that you are the black people, you are the white people, you are the yellow people, and you are the red people, and you are the whatever white people. and your interests are conflicting, zero sum game. All of you guys can't eat. And so the people at the bottom who are not part of the 1%, they fight for the scraps, but they don't even look up at the hand that's withholding most of the bread, who's throwing them all crumbs. They don't even look up. They don't bother to. So one of the things that they talk about in planning and strategy is you need to outsmart them. And the best way to do that is to pretend that you're their friend. That anytime there's a threat and anytime you're looking to have a reset or a big change where you're going to need to sacrifice, you got to sacrifice some of your citizens. Is it always has to be an external threat. It always has to be something that happens externally because it can't be you. It would be too obvious if you as a leader, as a politician, as a authority within that citizenry of so-called patriotism, you can't just say, we're going to do this because we're serving our rich elite masters. So you need something. You need a catalyst. Something that's outside that gives the people the illusion that these things are coming about as a reaction to something that you had nothing to do with. It's not you. It's just that this event happened. We were attacked by this group of so-called foreigners, outsiders, and we, in the best interest of you, need you to sacrifice some of your freedom, some of your rights, some of your resources. And when that economy does crash, it's not because of the scheme or the scam that we have, to where we as the owners and stockholders buy back the shares, exercise the options, translate the wealth into hard assets and use it to buy and conquer more things while dumping and leaving you holding the bag. The continual cycle of what we call churning. Churning? Then we rip the rug off from under you and you get laid off while we enticed you to buy those products and overextend yourself, knowing thereby that you would default on those products. And then we can start the cycle all over again because you never quite get that ownership. You never allow it to build a foundation of generational wealth, meaning you'll never be able to compete with the conglomerates. And if you do end up competing with the conglomerates, we got a remedy for that too. Maybe we have to shut down all the businesses. Maybe then only the big conglomerates with the deep reserve pockets will survive. And maybe the mom and pop shops, the second, third generational shops that are starting to be competition, maybe we can wipe them out too, for the most part. And as a bonus, just maybe something will happen to where it's not us now. It's not them that's doing it. It's mysteriously the earth just happens to coalesce with their goals as technology develops. For some reason, earth just decides it needs to cleanse the land of all these poor chattel. And who dies? It's not the rich elites. It's not the rich elites. As old as they are, they don't get taken out by it. Okay. So people don't understand the idea of a Trojan horse and what a Trojan horse is. People, a lot of times it seems like we as people are binary thinkers, that we don't understand the duplicity because we don't really believe the Bible. When the Bible talks about the heart's desperately wicked, we don't believe it. When the Bible says he that loves silver won't be satisfied with silver, meaning men are greedy And when the Bible talks about that pit, that bottomless pit, that pit is actually called man's heart because man's heart continually lusts for the things of this world, you know, the deceitfulness of riches. And because man wants to elevate himself above other man, we invent these little things, these little lies called races. You know, the Darwinistic belief of race, survival of the fittest, right? Or favored races, as the name was originally called. But then they erased because they didn't want it to be, they wanted to hide that that's what it's about. And then not only that, in our insanity, in our wickedness, we try to bring God into our craziness. And then we try to say God has a chosen race. And then we lie about God and we lie about the Bible and say, hey, prophecy's being fulfilled. There's a great pestilence on the land that's going to wipe out all these people. And then we say, oh yeah, isn't that in the Bible somewhere that people are going to go against God's chosen race? What color is God's chosen race, I wonder? Let's take a look. And then a lot of people are going to die. And then the laws will be a little bit more strict and stringent. No one will be able to buy or sell. Again, this is all based on their carnal interpretation of the Bible, which is a lie. Without taking the mark of the beast. It's funny because the Bible describes all men as beasts. You know, all men are dogs that need the crumbs that fall from the master's table. But he's talking about the bread of life. The beast that's defeated man is death. The enemy is death. You know, the devil goes around as a roaring lion seeking whom he may what? Devour. You know, the earth that you worship, the grave swallows you up in death. And Jesus says, those who believe, my sheep never perish. They get the victory over death. Death wears thy sting, grave wears thy victory. So I'm looking at this little interview. And in this interview, it's on BET. BET, for those who don't know, is a black entertainment television. Black entertainment television used to be decent. It used to be something that would talk about, quote unquote, starting businesses and entrepreneurships and things that are going on in the so-called black community. So as a young man, I used to watch, BET back in the early days of it. Well, BET got bought. And when it got bought up, it went more gangster rap and it turned to pretty much a lot of trash TV. It became really trashy, and it was very obvious that when it got bought out, it was just, how can we make money? How can we spew propaganda? How can we culture vulture? How can we influence the culture in a negative way? That's what it became. And the guy who bought, the company that bought it was Viacom, I guess Sumner Redstone. So I'm on YouTube and I'm watching this thing where this guy on BET is talking to Dr. so-called Fauci, and he's talking about COVID's disproportionate impact on Black America. Listen, COVID's disproportionate impact on Black America. And it just so happens I'm watching this, I previously did a video talking about the president, this expose on the president written by, I think, his niece, talking about the racism that he grew up being very racist, and his father calling him the great I am or something like that. And how his family was just, his father at least was very racist, and how he was racist. And how they're saying that when people would come to rent in their properties, they would put a C for colored. This is your president, would put a C for colored on that, on the application, to make sure that the people didn't get the place. But this is the president. This is the guy who's representing all Americans. Remember, America first. And then I look at the rhetoric that was done during the elections, where it was very obvious what was going on. And they're talking about his right-hand man, his senior advisor, a guy named Stephen Miller. Now, Stephen Miller is supposed to be classified as, quote-unquote, Jewish. Right, you know, the chosen race. Now, Stephen Miller and Donald Trump stand next together according to the classification of the fictitious invention of race. By skin color, their appearance is similar. And I was talking about how Stephen Miller was influenced by another guy. I guess his name was Horowitz. And these people are saying like, well, these guys are really, really racist, and they believed and supported what they call the white nationalist movement. And you're like, well, and they're like, well, that's really confusing because they're so-called Jewish. And then this is where America pretends or acts stupid as if they can't see that the people who call themselves the chosen race have the same skin color that they do. But for somehow, some reason, you just change your last name, put on a magic hat, and it's like, oh, I don't recognize you, Batman. Is that you? Huh. Interesting, Clark Kent. I don't recognize you without your shades and the S on your chest. This is the lunacy that we live in. Well, throughout this video, he talks about how black people are going to be hit harder, how it's a double whammy because of the underlying conditions. And he says, we got two things going against us. Notice this Dr. So-called Fauci. He says, we got two things going against us. Notice the language, it's us. Anytime they're planning things that seem to be going against you, where you're going to be disproportionately impacted, where you need to go to war, where your children needs to die, where it seems like there's going to be some sacrifices made, they use the language of us. Listen to them. I want you to listen to your politicians, because you got a lot of people who are claiming that they're medical officials. They're nothing but politicians. They're nothing but puppets playing their part. And they use this language of us. I'm going to give you an example of it.
Things going against you. You are physically in a position that's more likely you're going to get infected. And if you do get infected, you're more likely to have a serious outcome. To me, the thing to do is we need to focus and concentrate resources in those areas that are overrepresented by African Americans. In other words, allow you to get tested more quickly, results back.
So he says, here's what we need to do. Now he says it's you, African Americans, because he's trying to set the stage, right? He's letting you know ahead of time, black people, you're going to be disproportionately affected. Now he won't say you're going to be disproportionately targeted. No, you're going to be disproportionately affected. And then he goes on, how do we help? Here's what we need to do. But then he goes on to say, look,
it is more likely you're going to have a serious outcome. So we've got to just get a public awareness on the part.
So they're already touting that, you're more likely to have a serious outcome, meaning you're more likely to die. Then he brings up his colleague, and he talks about how he was part of the HIV project.
Example, I went through the same thing early on in the early years of HIV. The disproportionate number of African Americans who get HIV infection.
So he talks about HIV, and so if you know anything about the history of HIV, it's very, very interesting. And he talks about, what's anticipated.
Drop, others said they would spike. Based on the best information we have now, what should we anticipate between now and, say, November?
So he's setting expectations. So here's what you need to look for in the future. And he says, look, because, people didn't do the right thing. Of course you didn't do the right thing. George Soros, remember, Black Lives Matters, it was highly televised that all the black people were congregating outside, right? So now the world knows in so-called America, because it's on TV, that the black people were out protesting and they were gathering together and they were social distancing. So not only do you have these underlying conditions that are going to impact you, but you weren't social distancing, and you have what they call the essential jobs, that you guys don't work in the computer and the high-tech industries, and hence you can't practice social distancing. So he tells them it's going to be a dark winter.
When the fall and the winter comes, It's going to be complicated by the onset of the influenza season. And influenza is another respiratory illness. So you may have.
So he's saying all this stuff is going to be, it's going to be complicated. Now, anybody who's in a corporate setting, who's dealt with people and politicians, it's all this like euphemistic, coded language. It's going to be complicated, disproportionately impacted, blah, blah, blah. We need to streamline the processes, you know, et cetera, et cetera. In essence, he's saying it's going to hit the fan. It's going to be what they call a dark winter. You know? And you guys, you can probably look up these terms, dark winter, all this kind of stuff. You can look these terms up. Well, remember he talked about HIV. He goes on later to talk about one of his colleagues. His colleague is a person named Birx. I spelled it wrong here. I think it's Birx.
Are you optimistic that Florida and Georgia in particular will be responsive to your warnings?
I hope so. I know that Dr. Birx, Debbie Birx, my colleague on the coronavirus task force, has traveled down to several states over the last couple of days.
So this is what is always done. You know, you always come in as a friend. You always say we're doing everything to help you. If anybody studied history and you know the duplicity, people people like to think we've evolved now because, you know, we got look on TV, and so people don't understand the window dressing strategy. People really think that colonization is done. They really think it's over. It's not done. America has been the biggest whore. It is just a military arm of a bigger plan. And as they're faking prophecy, they said no, they pretended that these different countries were against each other. They're not. They'll tell you it's not. And there's, just because you as an individual citizen may not be in on it, trust me, the people, the powers that be, so to speak, they know what's going on. And they're not loyal to you at all. So he talked about his colleague, Birx. And the interesting thing, he talked about his association with the AIDS Project, HIV, and how HIV disproportionately impacted so-called black people. And his colleague, Deborah Birx, is working with him as part of this project. And here this man is on BET telling the black folks, because they got to get the voice out, though BET was purchased by Sumner Redstone of Viacom. Well, we go here to the Washington Times newspaper, and this is Deborah Birx, White House response. The interesting thing about him is he talks about the White House, response coordinator, Dr. Birx, cut her teeth in public health with the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Oh, they go way back. In fact, there's pictures of Dr. Fauci with Bill Gates. And as you know, Bill Gates is very, very active in the African continent. And she started her career in immunology in 1985 at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. At the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. Interesting. And it says rising to the head of the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, right? So it goes on to talk about her, and also talks about task force Mike Pence. Now, if you know anything about Mike Pence is very, very, very much in favor of what? That illusion over in the Middle East, right? And then you have Stephen Miller, who's the senior advisor to the president. He's a white nationalist, but he claims to be of the chosen race. Then you had Trump, who voted that Judaism is a race, and he declared Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel, which is funny because the Bible says Jerusalem above is free as mother of us all, and my kingdom is not of this world, and that anything that's in this world that's built by man's hands is of the devil. God doesn't dwell in a temple made with hands, neither does he worship with man's hands. So it talks about Burks, who's 63, how she's a professor. And then she would talk about her. But here's the thing that's really interesting about her. I want you to see something. She said, we had another silent epidemic, HIV, she said, at Monday morning's briefing, at Monday's briefing. I just want to recognize HIV epidemic was solved by the community, the HIV advocates and the activists who stood up when no one else would listen and got everyone's attention. We're asking that the same sense of community to come together and stand up against the virus. Listen, the HIV/AIDS epidemic hit home for her in 1983, immediately after the birth of her older daughter. And I just want you to know how these doctors, she just has a sixth sense. She just knew. Listen to this. You want to know how she just knew something? Listen to this, guys. Her obstetrician ordered a blood transfusion. Her doctor ordered her to do something, a blood transfusion. But listen to what the good Dr. Burks, somehow she just knew, magically. Listen, but she refused it based on her knowledge of the mysterious new infection that appeared to have contaminated the nation's blood. Now, wait a minute. She's a doctor, right? Before she walked into the hospital, she was a doctor, right? Then how come, if she knew that the blood was tainted, why didn't she yell from the rooftops, the blood is tainted, throw out all the blood? No, it's just that when she went to they were going to give her a blood transfusion, then it forced her to acknowledge what she already knew. She refused it based on her knowledge that the mysterious new infection that appeared to have contaminated the nation's blood supply, right? And it says how, and literally just before she passed out from pain, Debbie screamed, "Do not let them give me blood," Mr. Carey said. Her husband refused the transfusion, and it is a mighty good thing that he did, because the hospital later learned that the blood of her blood type that they would have used was contaminated with HIV. Magic.